Hey everyone, welcome back to the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Reminder to catch us on all the typical podcast locations and find us on our YouTube channel. We have a special episode for you today in which we're going to be talking all things U.S. elections as we're getting close to the imminent presidential elections, among others, in the U.S. And so going to be teeing up several topics here. Shashi will be beginning with you on the first one. Lexi, I'll pass to you, and then I'll kind of close out comments before moving on to the next section. So Shashi, we've got several recent events that are probably going to materially affect the outcome of this election, at least in the perception of the voters. The most prominent ones, of course, are probably the unfortunate assassination attempts on President Trump's life, of which there have been at least two well-documented reports. So I'll start there. Feel free to take that in any direction you want, and then kind of tie it back to influences on the election results if you think there's going to be a material one there.
Yeah, so the attempted assassination in Butler, Pennsylvania was the most kind of direct. I think there were a lot of voters who saw the immediate reaction by Trump as something that only a really strong leader could do, to stand up and sort of stand in defiance of that. And you didn't see him really slow down on the trail. He kind of continued his media appearances. I'd say it's really negative for any political party to call their opponent Hitler or kind of draw those kinds of comparisons. It leads to some people in the voting public taking it in the most literal way and taking it upon themselves to try to alleviate what they're being constantly told is Hitler. Donald Trump is nothing of the sort, and it just seems like a desperate play that has kind of potentially violent consequences. Elon, by the way, who's been on the campaign trail, has also had threats against his life, and I would just say that the kind of campaign rhetoric that we're seeing is unnecessarily leading to some people taking it in literal and potentially violent terms. But I think the net effect, to answer the question, the net effect of the assassination attempt is probably a net positive for Trump when it comes to voters at the ballot box.
Lexi, any response to that?
Yeah, I think so. Like with the assassination attempts, I think when you look at, for a lot of people, voting tends to be pretty emotionally driven. Like, I guess like the vast majority of people who anticipate like have started turning up to the polls, especially post Biden stepping away, post assassination. I think increasingly this election is based on caricature, right? And I think like fundamentally both these candidates are appealing to very, very different caricatures, and like I guess like what people identify with as like emotional pieces. I guess like I say all of that in like platform matters and the presidential role matters, but what matters more, I think, more than anything is like who gets put in Senate by these folks, like how much like of a bipartisan divide there is in the like executive and legislative branches that ends up being decisive for what the next 4 years looks like. And the difficult thing is, of course, like now it's become a lot more like, it's always been a little bit of celebrity, but right now it feels very, very celebrity. Like the vast majority of people are not checking platforms. They're generally going off of, I like this person more than the other. I think that applies to both sides. I think like there was a lot of momentum that Trump picked up because of the assassination attempt, because of this sort of like appearance of strength. And that absolutely played in like the Republican favor. Like, I mean, my impression is that like, especially before Trump was the nominee, like the Republican Party for the last I guess since Biden got nominated has been pretty divided just in general. And so it gave the party more strength in providing kind of like a unifying, I guess, feature, which is like resilience, grit, etc. That makes him, at least as a candidate, easier to kind of turn around and be like, okay, I was a Republican, not a fan of Trump. All of a sudden, like, okay, I can maybe back this guy.
I think there are a couple of things I'd like to pull attention to there. I mean, number one, Shashi, I think that you said it well when you said the political discourse around these elections becomes divisive in a way that endangers people. And that simply is, out of bounds. And we've seen unfortunate attempts, like you mentioned, both Trump and then, reported events for Elon as well. I think that ultimately, what Lakshay was getting at last is where my belief sits as well. Is anytime you're viewing these events, positive or negative events, things like the debate or these kind of outlier events, it comes down to how many of the people that are undecided does this sway. And so where I will give Trump praise is that in that moment, I think very few people would have been able to capitalize on that moment. Like that lasting image of him kind of holding his fist after the assassination attempt, I think resonates with people in a way that demonstrates strength and a type of leadership that I think can't be understated or can't be overstated rather. And my mind does return to how many of the quote unquote independent or, already undecided voters did that sway. And I think that it is true in the immediacy that there was a subtle bump like Lakshay was describing, maybe Republicans that wouldn't have been voting for Trump getting pulled in that direction. I'm not sure how many of the full undecideds would have swayed in that direction, especially given that we're now so many months removed from that event. But I do think in general, it was, like you said, overall net positive and truly unfortunate in the most literal sense of the word. Moving on from that, there are some other, I think, issues. Lakshay, I think you described it well in which you were saying these candidates are more or less caricatures of, ideologues that we're voting for and the political kind of engines underneath both those people and kind of the principles and the, issues, if you will, policy issues that are driving those, candidates are kind of the most important thing when trying to discuss, what are we actually voting for? How is that going to be disseminated over the next 4 years in there? So I'll start with you. We'll take these kind of one by one. Shashi, let's go to you first. Economy. How do you see economy kind of being potential, deciding factor for voters in this election? How do you see either of the candidates influencing positively or negatively the economy, both kind of, our the U.S. economy and then maybe globally, if you feel there's an influence there as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, economy is closely tied to so many of the other issues in this election. The voters that say the economy is their number one issue tend to favor Trump pretty significantly. So I think that's an issue that Trump has an advantage on if that's your primary voting issue. But it's also tied to border security. For example, if you're competing for work against people who are new immigrants, then you're going to find it more difficult to make money, and we've seen lots of reports of that kind of. Especially at the kind of non-college educated working class jobs where new immigrants coming over from the border could be competing with you for your job. So we definitely see that. We definitely see economy playing into taxation and how tax policy affects your perception of how well you're doing. Inflation is a key kind of component of economy as well. If you see inflation as making it harder for you to buy groceries for your family, then that's going to be the way you interpret the economy. And so all of those issues, I think, are plugged into each other in the overall theme of economy. And an economy, I think, tends to favor the person who has had a career in business versus the person who's had a career in government jobs.
Lakshay?
Yeah, I think I guess speaking specifically, I'm not going to use these terms in their correct format of macro and micro economics of all of it. So micro, I'm just going to say, just for the sake of my own dialogue, micro, I'm just going to refer to impact of the individual. Macro, I'll look at economic policy as it relates to other countries and global scale. I think generally macro level, the Republican platform intuitively makes a little bit more sense to me. I think the place that gets really interesting, that's a little bit more gray, and I think we've talked about this before, we've alluded to before, especially as it affects American innovation and where money cycles in American economies. But the tax rules in general, speaking for myself, for example, I'm in generally pretty good favor of less tax loopholes that allow tax burdens to be reduced on people. But one of the ones that's really interesting that's kind of coming down the pipe with the Democratic platform is a tax on unrealized capital gains, which I understand how that ends up being really impactful to the ultra wealthy and that sort of thing, and making sure that their money is contributing to the government equally. And on principle, I agree with tax burden should be easily distributed across the entire range of wealth classes. But what we've talked about that's really, really funny, that not confirmed to go in, like not signed per se, but what's happening with investment capital that goes into startups and goes into innovation, that sort of thing, that I think ends up being really, really disfavorable if that thing becomes real. Like if that tax becomes burdensome, and like, I understand that has to go away because of a loophole that exists in like how money works. But that one is kind of a hard one to kind of work through, that I like wish were a little bit different on the Democratic platform rather than the Republican.
I think the economy is an interesting test case for how politics is viewed in the voter base in the United States. And I just don't have enough familiarity with global elections to know, anything beyond kind of our domestic election here. But if you look back through election history, essentially, if people perceive the economy as good. So going back to Lakshay's kind of reference of micro and macro, if people can show up to the grocery store and pay less, if the prices of gas are down, then usually the incumbent is looked upon favorably and therefore more likely to win the upcoming election. If conversely, people feel like they are economically stressed, cost of groceries is too high, their wage increases are not outpacing inflation, et cetera, then it leans towards challenge or rival, basically independent of parties. I think the interesting thing from my perspective is that tends to be completely decoupled to things unrelated to the election of our president. And what I mean by that is, if you compare the inflation and response to potential inflation of the United States compared to other well-industrialized countries around the globe, we have outperformed almost every other country, and in many metrics, all other countries, in essentially all economic factors with a Democratic/Biden presidency. However, that is unrelated to the subjective feelings of people when they go into the grocery store. And because people have to spend more money to purchase groceries under a Democratic president than they did under a Republican president, they deem that as the incumbent doing a bad job. Whereas if you look at the objective data, that would be contrary to what the data is reporting when you compare how the U.S. is performing relative to other countries. And sure, we could maybe debate that the current presidency, the current political party in power, if you will, in the United States is closer to conservative than other countries. And in fact, a more conservative American presidency would yield even better results than the current incumbents. I think that's a fair argument. But I think relative to the world, based on all metrics, the U.S. would be succeeding in the global kind of macroeconomic environment. And I just find it fascinating that is often not contextualized or digested by voters simply because their prices are higher at the grocery store or the gas station. And to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that line of thinking is wrong or that it shouldn't be the primary decision factor. But it is, with the available data, we simply don't know under the current economic conditions if a Republican presidency would have yielded better or worse prices at the gas pump or the grocery store. And again, because it feels bad for people, I think there's just natural response to simply go away from the incumbent, and that kind of plays out through history. So I'll let either of you, Shashi, you want to respond to you?
Just to play back what you're saying, Damon, you're saying the nominal prices of eggs. So if the nominal price of eggs went from $5 to $12, people are going to immediately sort of emotionally perceive that as worse off for them.
Yeah, 100%. And they're usually going to blame whoever the incumbent is, Republican or Democrat. They're just a natural response to my life is observably worse economically than it was under the previous presidential regime. And therefore, I would vote for change. And that isn't contextualized with maybe there was a jump from 5 to 12 in the U.S. and a jump from 6 to 40 in some European country. It's not contextualized in that manner. It's simply where I was 4 years ago under a different presidency versus where I am today, independent of whatever economic pressures that are uncontrollable by the current, elected government. And this is not specific just to the president, but again, the president becomes figurehead of this. And I think that's where the debate centralizes. Great. Moving on from there, Shashi, you mentioned it, but I think one of the most important, and in fact, I think maybe even not polarizing issues of this election has been border security. And so I'll tee that up for you there. How do you perceive border security in the context of these two parties and these two candidates and kind of its impact on this election?
Yeah, the first question is, should we have a secure border? Should we have control over the people coming into the country, regardless of the policy that you think we should have? And in my mind, that's a definite yes. We need to have some secure system by which we control as a nation the people that come in and out of the country. And if you agree with that, then we need to have some policy that has a program by which people can enter the country for a certain kind of work. There are seasonal workers, for example. That has been the case for a very long time. We've had seasonal workers who perhaps live in Mexico, come to the United States for a farming season, participate in work for that season, and then return to their families. So that kind of work program has been around for a long time. The control of the border and securing the border is a critical issue for a lot of voters, and it's one that I think Trump has clearly demonstrated a better ability to control and much more in line with what voters want of all races, especially immigrants. There are a lot of immigrants in the United States who see an unsecure border as a non-starter. The people coming in over the southern border are not primarily Mexican anymore. It's a huge diversity of people from different countries that are coming in from the southern border. Not to mention the national security terrorism threat that could exist from people coming in who have bad intentions and have an easy access point to enter the country. So that feels like a critical issue. It's one that we've had trillions of dollars of government spending, many billions of dollars dedicated to securing the southern border over the last 3.5 years when Biden and Harris have been in office. And that has not gotten any more secure. In fact, we have far more people coming in now than we did 4 years ago. So it seems like a key issue that Trump has a clear, superior hand on.
Akshay, any response to that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll preface with I recognize the importance of the border security one. It's not one I'm well educated on. So I'm going to say everything I'm saying with that in mind. I guess from what I've heard, and again, limited information, is just I know Trump's, I'll try not to get to personality stuff. So I'm just backing off and just being purely cost oriented around it. I think the one thing I've not been persuaded on, and I'd be open to being persuaded, is that one particular party's approach is going to work better than the other. Because Biden had it on his platform, Kamala has it on her platform, Trump has it on his platform. All of these things cost money, and it is investment to make these things work. Does a wall that goes across the entire border actually do its job? I could be persuaded. I have no idea. But I don't have a reason to think that one party's approach is particularly better than the other's is. Trump's, from my understanding, is a little bit more draconian. On the other side, it's a little bit more just put more agents and that sort of stuff on the wall, on the borderline itself. Don't invest in physical infrastructure, that sort of thing. But I don't have reason to think it's an important issue. I don't have reason to know why one party has a better solve than the other.
The perhaps conspiracy theory, but the version of this that is told in Republican circles is that the Harris administration has intentionally had a very loose and open policy, and they also have an explicit, she's made multiple statements about this on interviews, of creating a short-term path to citizenship for the people who've come in over the border. And the thought process is that and Elon has said this explicitly as well, that combination of new voters with an immediate path to citizenship is the way that they see winning elections going forward. So it's almost an incentive to not have border security. And I would argue that border security is a far lower priority for the Harris and Biden administration than it would be under Trump again or was in the previous Trump administration.
I think where you began the conversation, Shashi, is the right approach, and that thinking about it from kind of a first principles basis of, does a nation, in order to thrive and continue to excel, need a secure border? In which I think the answer is a very clear yes. And then you can begin to parse what the details of a secure border mean. I side more with Shashi, I think, on this particular issue, just in given that it does feel to me viscerally, and from what I understand, that the Republican platform is stronger on the issues of border security. That said, the thing that I find my internal conflict with is that the humanitarian aspect of how do we enable people that are fleeing unfortunate, sometimes dangerous situations to seek asylum effectively in this country while working towards legitimate citizenship needs to be balanced with this idea of ironclad security. And that to me is a very difficult issue to parse, and one in which I'm not in any way an expert to be able to comment on. It does feel to me like in the last few years, perhaps maybe for a good reason, the pendulum has swung too far in the aspect of humanitarianism, and that has led to some potentially unpleasant externalities or unintended consequences. And we are kind of seeing the detriments of potential unintended consequences right now, where I don't know how much truth or if the data backs the idea that the majority of undocumented immigrants, unlawful citizens, whatever we want to call them, are voting for Democrats. I think that in aggregate, that would be true. I just don't know, given the fact that it's difficult to gather that census data, it's unclear to me how much of that is a substantiated claim versus something that is, I think, intuitively likely, but overall, it's difficult to place numbers on for me. So I think there's something to what you said, Shashi, where people that are coming here on a faster track to citizenship are more likely to vote Democrat. I think that is true. I don't know how pervasive, let's say, that is. And I also find it somewhat fascinating in that the areas most afflicted by an unsecure southern border are not generally swing states. So meaning even if those undocumented people were coming across the border and voting somewhere, they would only be material votes in areas of swing states. And so then I think the argument becomes kind of a fairly nuanced one of geographic relocation, where are these people settling, where are the votes being casted, et cetera, all of which I find incredibly difficult to try to deconvolute. And so I find it's a fascinating issue, and one that I think that we will see play out over time. But I do find myself in a little bit of cognitive dissonance around which platform I think has the more thoughtful approach when it comes to balancing almost competing objectives, humanitarian versus kind of ironclad security. Any response by either of you to that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. I think your assessment is one that generally align with. I think that that's the thing that for me is that I can't also, there's an element of this that is it's hard for me to not speak about the part of it that says the rhetoric that is being sold to the masses of that's very xenophobic and fear mongering in nature, and saying who these people are that are coming across the border. Whereas fundamental matter of fact, I think is yes, there can be bad actors, but most of these people are just trying to get by. And so we should secure the border, but ultimately the way that we have to be executing that has to be generally pretty humane and considerate. Especially just given that I think it's pretty dangerous that I can pretty comfortably say that the vast majority of folks who are voting Republican are thinking that most of the people that they're trying to eject are bad criminal actors. I think that's kind of bad dialogue. And regardless of what the truth or the data is, I think it's dangerous because the border security one has turned into a little bit of race fear mongering, a little bit of oh, you should be terrified of these people who are coming across the border. I don't think that's a healthy thing for democracy.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that the rhetoric around this is unhealthy and unnecessarily negative. Most of these people are not here to conduct criminal activity or be part of gangs. Most of these people are just trying to make it work and trying to keep their children fed and safe. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Moving on, I think there's one topic that's particularly on this ledger that's important to me, and I think important to us, and it ties in with the conversation we've been having around global economics. So we'll go there next. Shashi, I'll start with you again. This idea of national debt on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, we are adding billions and trillions of dollars to our national debt. It seems to me, setting the stage for you, that almost neither party is attacking this issue directly head on. I'm curious how you're seeing this, especially with weights to the scale of either side.
I think that's right. I think we have a national debt problem, and I don't think either candidate has a good solution proposed. The real solution lies in normalizing our spending. Steve Ballmer, former CEO of Microsoft, has this podcast and this group called, I believe it's called Just the Facts. We'll link it in the show notes. He produces videos and content that is purely factual about all kinds of topics related to the government, just providing numbers. And one of the things he has is a video about how much we're spending and how much we take in, and therefore how much debt we have a year. The biggest expenditures that we have are what are called fixed expenditures, which are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are the biggest line items, and those absorb many, many trillions of dollars. And so that's our expenditure that is primarily driving our indebtedness. When we started Social Security, we started it at a time where lifespans were very close to the age of 65. And so our spend has significantly increased because we are now supporting people for 30 years of life, which was never the intention of Social Security. This is a hard conversation. It's a hard conversation to adjust an expectation of a government subsidy where people have become used to kind of expecting it, and it's going to be difficult to unwind this fixed payment. But those are the kinds of things that neither candidate has taken on, and frankly, if either candidate tried to, they would lose a lot of votes. So it's a losing political issue. But this is the real underlying problem: is the fixed expenditures that the government overall has committed to, that we need to find a path to unwind. So not really election related, but it's a problem.
That's interesting. I mean, again, this is another thing that I can't say I'm educated on, because especially like my consumption of political information comes through like news cycles, and as you're saying, like it's not in their interest to be talking about it. So to hear it through that lens is interesting. I don't know what solve is. I'd be interested to see like what a political theorist in general says, like what to do about national debt. Like it'd be interesting to read, but I can't say I know enough about it right now to have a useful conversation.
Yeah, I think, Shashi, you covered most of the basis. I mean, my general take on this is it is a politically untenable solution and problem set for either party. Essentially, what you have to do is you have to balance the ledger, meaning reduce costs and increase the amount of money coming in through taxation or other means. On either side of those two things, you alienate various parts of voting demographics on both sides of the aisle. And I just simply don't see any candidate talking about it, because I don't think that either political engine, Democrat or Republican, have a policy that thoughtfully addresses this in a way that would be digestible by their voters. And so I'm not exactly sure where we go from here. The reason I brought it up, and I think it's one of such interesting debate, is to me, it is the one in which it feels like neither party is tackling. And I'm not sure that the incentives are ever going to be aligned such that anybody is going to. And therefore, it feels to me like of all the issues, it's the one most likely to reach some sort of critical breaking point on some timeline. I don't have the political or the economic expertise to be able to thoughtfully illustrate or debate that timeline, but I just find it it feels to me like at the very least, all of the other issues that we are discussing, there are proposed solutions, good or bad, to. This one is the one that feels to me like the least proposed solution. Maybe transitioning that into a related topic is this idea of foreign wars. We obviously are seeing global conflicts going on around the world. The US dollar is obviously involved in this, and a lot of military might and revenue thereof goes to the US's military and support or opposition. said wars. So, Shashi, I'll start with you again. Give us your general thoughts on foreign wars, again, how it kind of pertains to this election, if there's tie into national debt or either candidate, et cetera.
Yeah, first, we don't overspend on the military. Our military spend is significantly less than the mandatory expenses of Social Security, Medicare, and so our 800 billion or so is very much in line with what you would expect a country of our size to have for military spend. I don't see the fundamental issue as the spend. I see the fundamental issue as what do we choose to get involved in the world and how. I would prefer a government orientation that is less interfering with world affairs. That is my disposition, my preference. I don't think we have a history of getting that right. I think we've armed many military groups in the past that we thought we were allied with against a specific enemy, only to later be fighting that same military group we just armed. And a much more patient, less interfering version of the United States would be a better one, in my view. So I would prefer us not to cut military spending at all. In fact, perhaps there's room to even increase it a little bit to continue to secure our country from foreign threats. Geography helps the United States immensely here. Having an ocean between us and Europe, having an ocean between us and Asia, really insulates us from foreign threats. We should operate more in line with that benefit that we have, that incredible geographic benefit that we have. We should be propping up and supporting developing economies to continue to succeed and be great trade partners. And if that means using our military to secure trade routes, that's a great use of our military. Arming militaries around the world, whether that's in the Middle East, in former Russian states, I just think it's a losing endeavor for us to spend a ton of money and provide our best arms and weapons and systems around the world. There are going to be things we can't solve, no matter how involved we get, and we should have enough humility to see that.
Generally speaking, Shashi, I completely agree with the thesis that you just kind of laid out. I'm curious if you feel like that thesis more strongly aligns with the current platforms of either party. Because to me, it feels like the right thesis, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's directly in line with either party, and you're kind of sharing shades of both. So I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Yeah, I think it absolutely distinguishes the two candidates, utterly and completely distinguishes the two candidates. Donald Trump is not one to want to get involved in foreign wars, and what you saw is him try to use diplomacy and negotiation to avoid foreign conflict. He sees that they're almost always quagmires. When we get involved in these foreign wars, it ends up being a huge quagmire for us. Look at Afghanistan, look at the Korean Wars, Vietnam War. All of these things end up ultimately distracting us from the thing that we do best, which is innovation and pushing the world forward economically. That's what we should be doing with more of our energy. So I think that's the approach that Trump would take. You saw Trump not take that approach primarily because of John Bolton. So there's a group of politicians that have followed the thread from cross-party, from George H.W. Bush through Clinton, through George W. Bush, even through Obama. And there have been deep state administrators that have lived inside the government entity for so long throughout that tenure. And they've wanted primarily to exert their influence around the world. Right? We talk about global affairs and how America sees itself. There is a cohort of people who see themselves as fundamentally steering world events for the benefit of American hegemony. And I don't think that is the right role for America to play. I think we live in a much more multipolar world now than we did when it was a bipolar world with us and Russia. And I think we should play much more of a non-interference role than we have in the past. Kamala Harris's administrative team comes from that same orthodoxy. Joe Biden was a part of that orthodoxy. Kamala Harris was a part of that orthodoxy, where we need to be involved in things all over the world, and we need to exert American influence. And I would rather see us display humility and say there are going to be issues we cannot solve and we will not get involved in. They're going to be bad. They're going to be around the world. And no matter how much money and how much time and how many human beings we throw at that, it's not going to get any better. So we're going to play a diplomatic role, a trade security role, but a non-interference role at a certain level.
Yeah, so like in general, like I think I think America having for the last like half century playing like international police, I think has generally been a pretty negative thing. And just like in the moment, I'm like it was a protective measure, like protecting America's economic interests, like capitalism versus communism. Cold War makes a lot of sense. Um, but I think like going forward, I would also kind of incline towards like less involvement is for the better. But I say that with the nuance that like, especially in the current moment, like I think like the next like 5 to 6 years, we're approaching a bunch of turning points. And to me, it's unclear whether now is the right time to turn, given that we are already involved in a lot of these places, right? Like, I think for me, like Russia, Ukraine, like we've invested really heavily in Ukraine, obviously, to back them and like help them survive and take this war. That aside, Middle East aside, like the one that I'm like the most like I think a lot about is Taiwan specifically, and how China isn't like asserting its influence across like the larger Pacific. That one to me feels really, really gray. Like it feels to me like yes, we should be less involved, and yes, we should be playing international police, but especially with like how critical Taiwan is for just like a lot of global infrastructure and a lot of like forward progress worldwide, and how much we have like how much the world has a dependency on them. That one to me like trips me up in saying that absolutely. You know, like it's hard for me to say like, yeah, America should just like stay out, use like tariffs, use like policy diplomacy to solve that problem. I can't say sitting here right now that that feels like I can say that with high confidence about like Taiwan and China, for example.
Yeah, I think there's a delicate balance, and this is one of the issues in which I feel the least qualified to comment on. Truthfully, this is some of the things that kind of very simply I don't understand the political nuance of trying to manage these relationships in different countries and how the international diplomacy kind of functions, and it makes it very difficult for me to understand, to Lakshay and Shashi's point, where playing international police, for lack of a better word, is a thoughtful and therefore positive EV maneuver versus where it is just simply us trying to project ideology on a world that might not be receiving of it. And I find this to be a obviously important one, and one that has potentially very large inflection points in the coming years, as both of you illustrated, but one that I find difficult to kind of position myself on.
I will say, yeah, like I think like one thing that like I think is interesting to me is like I think right now politics kind of paints a couple of like core enemies, like core like opposition states. Right now it's Russia, China, maybe a little bit of Korea, to what are American interests. And like I think like in general and just like global power, whatever that's supposed to mean, like I guess ability to like control economies and ability to like have independence of state and while still being like a supreme like I guess leader economically, like having high levels of influence. Like I understand the rhetoric with China, I understand the rhetoric with Russia. It is hard for me to trust Trump as a character with Russia. I think his relationship with Russia has been really, really complicated. And I don't like that. Yes, even though he's saying he's like anti-Putin, wants to get out of Ukraine whatsoever, is like, I don't trust him to not be kind of duplicitous, I guess, as a character in regards to like what his relationship with Russia is. Like that's a big gap to me, especially just given historically what the relationship has been.
I think that's an interesting point there on the end, and I think it very nicely segues into some of our kind of closing things here. Shashi, I'm going to tee you up. Being from Texas, a predominantly red state, being a thoughtful voter that is evaluating these issues and both candidates independently, I'm curious if you want to volunteer a Kamala Harris straw man, and then I'll turn the floor to Lakshay to do the opposite side and deliver a Trump straw man. So starting with you, what do you think the straw man argument is for Kamala?
Yeah, great question. And just to respond to Lakshay's point about Russia, Russia and China historically have not been allies. They've been in opposition to one another for a long time. They have a natural opposition by having a shared border. So there is an inherent tension there. We drove through our policies by putting NATO on Russia's border, which was a just stupid, unnecessary decision. To drive NATO all the way to Russia's border, we drove Russia into China's arms as a partner. We should have been continuing to ally with Russia because the only real global superpower that matters in competition with the United States is the growth of China. Those are the two countries that are vying for global strength and the primary position. And we should have taken a position of partnering with Russia rather than pushing them away. And I think we took the wrong tack there, and it really hurt us. In going forward, how do I draw a straw man for Harris's candidacy? So the way I would draw that is that if you believe that Trump, if the personality of Trump and his ability to alienate people makes it too hard to govern, that Trump's personality flaws and his speech and the way he talks about people are fundamentally going to undermine our ability to get anything done as a country, then the argument I would make as a straw man for Kamala is to disqualify Trump based on his personality and his rhetoric. And the policies, I have a hard time creating a straw man for Harris, in part because nobody knows what she actually believes. You know, like there's a great line in Hamilton of Hamilton says, "I've never agreed with Jefferson once. We've disagreed on like 75 different fronts, but when all is said and all is done, Jefferson has views, Burr has none." And in a way, I kind of see this election in that way, that I've disagreed with Trump on a million things, on 75 different fronts, but when all is said and all is done, Trump has beliefs, and Kamala doesn't seem to have any. I don't think she does. So that's fundamentally how I see the two candidates. But if I'm going to straw man Kamala, I would say that Trump's personality and rhetoric disqualify him and make it impossible for him to get anything done, and therefore that Harris would make the better candidate.
Akshay, you want to play the opposite side?
Yeah, so I guess I kind of look at, when you remove the person on the platform from it, I kind of look at it as two ways. Like there's two angles you can take on it, right? You can look at a country as an atom in like a collection of countries, right? It is one unit that exerts force on the other atoms around it, whether that's China, Russia, UK, whosoever, right? The other version is a country is a collection of people who have a voting opinion that have representatives that then do things with those voting opinions, right? And so I think like if I were to make an argument against Kamala, it's because it is not clear to me as an atom how the exertion of force outside of the atom actually plays. It's relatively weak. It doesn't say a lot, right? I think like what the Democratic platform is a lot, I guess like evocatively the sort of people are trying to pull are people who are focused on like, what does this mean for the civilian? Like, what does this mean for the person day to day? But ultimately, like, if I had to make an argument in favor of the Republican platform, is that like, is much more lucid as an atom in the global frame, what they want to do and how that will work. And I think like when you are trying to like decide, I think a lot of it comes down to that, where like clearly the place that like people are swaying that ends up being Democratic ends up being like much more, I think a lot of them are touchy affairs, and on the Republican side, a lot more of them end up being like talked about divisively, but at least at the global level, it's much more clear like how the Republican platform does well. Whereas Democrat still feels like it's going to be a lot more relatively the same. And for a lot of people, that's even unclear as to what that means.
I think that's well said. I think that playing both those arguments back, I think that Shashi's point around is the character of Trump a disqualifying factor? Yes or no? I think for a large swath of the voters, the answer to that would be yes, although I return to, I don't know how many of those voters would be undecided given any other candidate voting. Therefore, I don't know how much it actually moves the needle in those swing states. It does feel to me like a vote for Kamala right now is more a vote against Trump than it is a vote for any of Kamala's policies. I think both of you laid out the primary critique that I would myself levy of Kamala is it going to be more of the same that we've had with Biden, and then that can be good or bad depending on your kind of agenda and perspective, or is it going to be radically different? And the fundamental unknown is that we simply don't no. And the reality is, given the hot swap, given the nature of how quickly she's had to run her campaign and her general avoidance of public speaking that involves anything besides her just kind of reciting already pre-drafted notes or teleprompter scripts, I think makes it very difficult for us to understand exactly where she lies on a lot of these policies and kind of where the metaphorical ship will be headed. Lexia actually really appreciated the way that you laid out that atomized analogy. I think that was really well said. I think that a lot of the people that will be supporting the Democratic candidate in this election will be looking at the influence that will deliver nationally and the effect on the day-to-day lives of people. Not that the Republican candidacy won't, but the kind of global impact and the way that the United States is positioned in the world feels like it is more strongly aligned with at least the more clear objectives of the Republican side, which I think is well said. So guys, as we move into our last category here, Lexi, I'm going to start with you. It's prediction time. So again, you would live in a predominantly blue state. I think it's very easy to predict the states in which you live. But out of curiosity, where is your natural lean on the president's the presidential election overall?
I look at the election right now from the angle of like media coverage has made it very, very easy for like a lot of really loud things to get a lot of visibility. I think in my perception, it to me feels like it will be a blue win solely from the fact that I think that like the Trump platform is quite divisive just by nature. And I think like we'll see an uptick. Like I think it'll be quite close. But my inclination is to think that like the vast majority of silent voters are going to lean blue because of character, is my guess. Like I think the lay person who's like just kind of like getting a ballot and having to make a choice is not going to abstain. They're probably going to be more inclined to vote personality driven more than anything. And that's going to be at least close to a cause for blue win, even if the platforms are weak in whatever respect to one another.
Joshi?
There's an interesting Trump effect with polling. We've seen this in the last two elections, that the polling tends to, for some reason or another, kind of undercount his support. I think my prediction is that economy and strength will be the things that make people feel safe. And I think if it comes down to economy and people's feeling of being safe in their country, that Trump projects more of that feeling. It comes down to 7 swing states. The Democrats need what are called the blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, they need to win all of those to have a viable shot. I think it's going to be difficult for the Democrats to win all of those. I don't think there's enough support in those key states for an anti-Trump vote. Fundamentally, I think what we're describing, we're trying to predict is the shape of an anti-Trump vote versus the shape of a pro-Trump vote. And I believe that the shape of the pro-Trump vote, when it comes down to it, will be a bit stronger than the anti-Trump vote. And I think enough people see the Harris candidacy as a continuation of the existing state, which, because there hasn't really been a description of how the current candidacy is different from the existing state. So I think they see the Harris candidacy as a continuation of the current state, and enough people want change that I think that will drive some amount of motivation to vote for Trump. So my prediction is that Trump will win. I don't think it'll be super close. Harris may win on the popular vote. I think that will be pretty interesting, which candidate ends up winning on popular vote. But I think Trump will win pretty comfortably in terms of electoral college.
Fascinating. I think the one thing I will disagree with Lakshay on, not because I don't believe it to be true, but because it hasn't been evidenced so far, most of the undisclosed voters, most of the people that have not been partaking in the poll, but that have actually been showing up to election ballots on election days or in pre-voting, lean Trump. People just simply don't want to signal that they are voting for Trump, and then they kind of end up voting for Trump. So it'll be curious to know how that kind of breaks down. Shashi, the one place where I think I would push back on yours is I see the opposite being true in my relative certainty of the elections, meaning I think the popular vote actually is quite certain in that it will lean for Kamala, and the electoral college vote, ultimately the one that matters, will be very close. And in fact, it feels to me like I think if I was going to just make a solid projection, I think that independent of my own preferences, it feels to me like we are headed towards a Trump presidency for a lot of the reasons that you outlined, Shashi, and that a vote for Kamala feels like a vote for much in the same. And there's a large swath of people currently that feel like change is better than remaining the same. But we will see. That's a wrap for today. So thank you all for joining us for this special edition of the ScholarAI Founders Pod. Quick reminder to find us on all the typical podcast locations and check us out on our YouTube channel. See you all next time. Not a little.